Look at me, I got a gun on my blade. It's a gun blade. Hello everyone and welcome to my breakdown and review of the Gunbreaker in Final Fantasy XIV. This is part 2 of a series where I'm going to cover all of the classes in this game in solid depth and give new and returning players a good feel of what this game has to offer, or alternatively to inspire veterans to pick up this class and give it a try themselves. As someone who has maxed out every single job in Final Fantasy XIV and has been playing them for about a month now, taking them to raids, expert roulettes, extreme primals, and other content for the past few weeks, I feel I can shed some unique insight into how each class plays. I do plan to do comparison videos in the future between the jobs and cover more jobs in depth in the future, so if that sounds great to you, please click that subscribe button, leave a like, and hit the bell for notifications. Every single subscribe and like really counts and does a lot to help me, especially because I'm such a new channel, and so it would be extremely appreciated. So before I get into this video, I want to just put out a quick disclaimer. Anyone that really loves and enjoys the classes I cover, or alternatively doesn't enjoy them, should feel more than entitled to their thoughts, feelings, and opinions, and that this is in no way me attempting to say that people are wrong. All jobs are able to complete all content. This video is simply meant to be a breakdown and give my own personal thoughts, opinions, and feelings on the class and see how it plays relative to the other jobs in my experience. In this video, I'll be covering the job niche and the overall big picture of the class, damage rotations, defensive cooldowns, party utility, and handy macros. Lastly, I will end with a review of the pros, the cons, and then my final personal rating of the class. The Gunbreaker is one of the 4 tanking jobs in Final Fantasy XIV. Wielding the very iconic Gunblade, they charge into battle as the highest damage tank class in the game, while boasting the largest array of tools for prolonged survivability over time, opposed to burst survivability. Core to the entire Gunbreaker's rotation is timing their abilities on a 60 and 30 second burst phase timers to pair them together with their damage buff that comes off cooldown every minute. In terms of damage, I'd give the Gunbreaker 5 potatoes out of 5, I'd give their party utility 4 potatoes out of 5, I'd give their burst survivability 2 potatoes out of 5, and finally, I'd give their prolonged mitigation ability 5 potatoes out of 5. In terms of the damage rotations for the Gunbreaker, normally I'd start this out by going over their basic 1-2-3 combo that you'll spam throughout the game, but I do need to do some explaining on 2 fundamental components of the Gunbreaker. Firstly, the Gunbreaker's main class mechanic is their powder gauge. This gauge allows you to see how many cartridges you have loaded into your gunblade. You can have a maximum of 2 cartridges stored at any time. Any other abilities that would add a cartridge won't add a third, and the cartridge effect will be wasted. Cartridges can then be consumed to use one of 3 extremely high damaging abilities that I will cover soon. Secondly, the Gunbreaker has access to self-buff called No Mercy that will increase their damage dealt by 20% for 20 seconds on a 60-second cooldown timer. And with that being said, you can probably see where I'm going with this. We're going to try and stuff absolutely everything we possibly can into this 20-second window every 60 seconds, especially the cartridge skills mentioned above. So keeping these 2 aspects of the Gunbreaker's kit in mind, let's proceed on. Gunbreaker's basic single target rotation is a spammable 1-2-3 of Keen Edge, leading into Brutal Shell, and then ending with Solid Barrel. Keen Edge just does damage, however the other 2 parts of this basic rotation have pretty important properties attached to them. Brutal Shell will both heal the Gunbreaker for 150 potency and add a 150 potency shield to the Gunbreaker. Due to the nature of this adding a shield to the Gunbreaker, this makes the ability relevant even if you are kept at full HP by a very attentive healer. Otherwise, it is still a total of 300 total potency mitigation every rotation. To give some perspective into the significance of that, using Brutal Shell heals me for a little over 3,000, and then the shield is going to be equivalent in value. So a bit over 6,000 mitigation just there, relative to me using Benefic on my Astrologian that heals for roughly 12k with 400 potency. This means that doing each of your normal rotations mitigates damage from your health bar for about half of a Benefic each time, relieving some healer pressure. Next off, we have Solid Barrel that adds 1 cartridge to the powder gauge. For a basic area of effect rotation, the Gunbreaker goes from Demon Slice to Demon Slaughter. Demon Slaughter simply adds one cartridge to the powder gauge. These are both circular AoE abilities around the Gunbreaker. And now I want to really get into what I call independent abilities that are outside of a rotation. These include Sonic Break and Bow Shock. Bow Shock has a 60-second cooldown timer and applies a hard-hitting damage over time effect to all targets around. However, this is also extremely important to apply in single target situations, as the total damage that the damage over time effect will have greatly outweighs most of your single target abilities. Lasting Zone is a 30-second cooldown extremely heavy hitting ability. Rough Divide is an ability that I want to add here as well, and I really feel the need to explain why. Rough Divide is a gap closer that moves the Gunbreaker towards the target and is an asset for overcoming range constraints. Absolutely. However, this ability features 200 potency to it that can be weaved in between other abilities to increase your single target damage, boasting the ability to hold 2 charges of Rough Divide at any time, where 1 charge comes back every 30 seconds. This will let you hold a grand total of 2 charges with Rough Divide every 60 seconds. This makes Rough Divide a very useful ability to continue to weave in even when you do not need a gap closer. Remember when I said that part of Gunbreaker's fantasy was 60 and 30 second cooldown burst cycles? This all together is why. Now let's get into the powder gauge in depth. We already talked about how it can hold a maximum of 2 cartridges, and that these cartridges are acquired by using the either Demon Slaughter or Solid Barrel abilities in their respective rotation. However, the Gunbreaker learns the Bloodfest ability that grants them 2 cartridges immediately upon use with 90 seconds of cooldown time. These 3 abilities combined together are how you will unlock access to the 3 cartridge consuming skills. The consumer skills include Faded Circle, that is an extremely powerful circular AoE around the Gunbreaker, Burst Strike, that is an extremely heavy hitting single target ability, and lastly Gnashing Fang, which is an ability with its own unique rotation that I'm going to take a bit of time here to explain. Gnashing Fang is the first ability of a 1-2-3 combo that leads into Savage Claw and then into Wicked Talon. Each of these abilities does extremely high damage. Only Gnashing Fang needs a cartridge. Savage Claw and Wicked Talon do not require a cartridge. Once you are in this rotation, Gnashing Fang goes on a 30-second cooldown timer. While this next part might sound intimidating to newcomers, it really is quite easy to use in practice. We have an ability called Continuation that may be used in between each of Gnashing Fang, Savage Claw, and Wicked Talon. This results in the Gunbreaker using the abilities Jugular Rip, Abdomen Tear, and Eye Gouge respectively. In practice, what you should be doing is that once you enter this rotation, you press Gnashing Fang, and then immediately between the global cooldowns you press the button for Continuation, which will execute Jugular Rip, and when the global cooldown is ready, press Savage Claw, and between global cooldowns press Continuation again to execute Abdomen Tear. Next global cooldown, press Wicked Talon, and between the global cooldown for the next phase, you're gonna hit Continuation again to execute Eye Gouge. This essentially boils down to me pressing the same 1-2-3 rotation with these 3 abilities, but after each of the 1-2-3, I will press the keybind for Continuation, and in reality it is truly just that simple. That being said, this rotation is extremely high damage in quick succession, but it is locked behind both having 1 cartridge to enter the rotation, as well as a 30-second cooldown timer preventing spamming. Taking a step back to the other cartridge consumer skills, in an AoE situation, you're always going to prefer Faded Circle. In a single target situation, you're going to prefer the Gnashing Fang combo whenever possible. However, while the Gnashing Fang combo is on cooldown and you risk having a 3rd cartridge be added and wasted, dump a cartridge into Burst Strike rather than waste the new incoming cartridge. Finally, to tie up this section, before we go into more specific endgame rotations, we need to talk about our 2 abilities as ranged options on Gunbreaker. Lightning Shot will deal light damage and increase aggro on the mob, and while the damage is light, it is better than no damage at all, and it is recommended when you're not close to target to spam this for some chip damage. Finally, Rough Divide we already talked about as our gap closer. In terms of endgame rotations, I'll start by talking about the AoE rotation, which is nice and simple. Go from Demon Slice into Demon Slaughter, giving you a cartridge to pour into Faded Circle. Use Bloodfest when it is off cooldown, and then follow up with 2 instances of Faded Circle. As for single target rotation, let's tie everything together that we have covered in a very nice circle. The entire underpinning of the rotation is a 20-second duration No Mercy buff that comes up every 60 seconds. During this 20-second duration, we want to be pouring every single last resource that we possibly can into it. I will break up the entire 1-minute rotation into a few different sections. First of all, you have Initial Pull, you have the No Mercy phase for first 20 seconds, you have Downtime, you have a 30-second phase, you have Downtime again, and then you're back to the start of the circle with the No Mercy phase. For the initial pull, start off the encounter by pulling the target with Lightning Shot, followed up by Bloodfest to max out your cartridges. Follow up by using the first strike of Keen Edge and then popping No Mercy. Now we're in the first 20 seconds phase, or the No Mercy phase. Immediately use Sonic Break followed by Bow Shock, leading into the Gnashing Fang combo, remembering to spam continuation between each. As a recommendation, I'd say that it would be ideal to try and fit in Blasting Zone on top of continuation between the Gnashing Fang and Savage Claw abilities on global cooldown. Likewise, I'd recommend fitting in Rough Divide alongside the other 2 continuation abilities between each of the global cooldowns before the global cooldown is up. If possible, follow up with Brutal Shell and then Burst Strike and then finish off with Solid Barrel. Next up is the downtime phase. Even if it is only roughly 10 seconds in this instance, downtime is pretty generic for the Gunbreaker. You're just going to be spamming your 1-2-3 combo of Keen Edge, Brutal Shell, and Solid Barrel. However, if you're full on cartridges and about to cast Solid Barrel again, which would add a third that would go to waste, then you're going to be pressing Burst Strike to utilize the cartridge rather than let it go to waste. However, always make sure that you hold on to at least one cartridge going into the No Mercy and 30-second phase for the Gnashing Fang combo. This downtime is handled the exact same way as the next downtime phase that's coming up later in the circle, after the 30-second phase. Next up is the 30-second phase. Blasting Zone and Gnashing Fang combo are now both off their cooldowns and should be used. During this time you'll also get 1 charge of Rough Divide, however please try and avoid using it as you can get 40 more potency per Rough Divide when they're used during the No Mercy phase. Once these are used, it's time to go back into downtime phase, exactly the same phase as before but for a longer period of time. For this rotation, I actually made larger icons that are separate from my hotbars because there were a few key abilities that I find very useful for making sure that you keep your eye on for the cooldown. These are Bloodfest, Gnashing Fang, and Blasting Zone. All of them should be used off cooldown, and so bringing attention to this is extremely handy. There, and with all that being said, the circle is complete, and that is the entire rotation of the Gunbreaker. Likewise, I have put a link to FF rotations in the description below where you can look up the rotation in depth and then keep it as a quick refresher for yourself. Next up, let's talk about defensive cooldowns. Relative to other tanks, the Gunbreaker has access to the largest variety of mitigation tools that do not interfere with its core rotation. First off, we'll go into the general tank roll cooldowns. Rampart is the first ability I will discuss here and is the workhorse of the tank class. It gives 20% damage mitigation for 20 seconds on a relatively short 90-second cooldown timer. Arm's Length will give you a temporary buff where any enemies that strike you are slowed by 20% for 15 seconds. Unfortunately, this is an ability that I've seen that is widely misunderstood and only seen for its anti-knockback effect that is useful for particular fights such as Eden 2 Savage. This is also extremely potent during large mob pack pulls during Expert Roulette, although unfortunately boss monsters won't be given the slow effect and thus it's not going to be a useful ability to use under boss situations. Reprisal is a temporary debuff that you can apply to a target that will lower their damage dealt by 10% for 5 seconds. This is extremely useful for reducing tank buster damage and raid-wide AoE damage. Fourthly and finally, Low Blow is a stun for 5 seconds on a 25-second cooldown timer, and while that might seem like a temporary and short amount of time, during larger pulls giving the healer even a slight bit of breathing room can be very appreciated. However, stuns and interrupts should be safe for mobs that cast abilities that can be prevented through stuns and interrupts. Now I'll be talking about the Gunbreaker specific cooldowns. Gunbreaker has a whopping 6 different abilities that they can use to offset damage. First off, we have Camouflage that's going to increase the parry rate of the Gunbreaker by 50%, and this reduces the damage taken by 10% for a grand total of 20 seconds on a 90-second cooldown timer. Well, you might think that this is worse Rampart because it only gives increased parry rate and 10% damage mitigation. Parry, however, does give a 20% mitigation from each attack that is parried, and right now I believe that the base parry rate is 20%, and so this should increase it to a total of 30% chance to parry. But ultimately, if we're talking plainly here, an extra 10% mitigation is extra 10% mitigation. This ability features a very low 90-second cooldown, making it one of the lowest mitigation cooldowns. Next off, we have Nebula that's going to straight out give 30% damage mitigation for 10 seconds. However, this is a longer cooldown at 120 seconds. Super Blide is the planned mechanic avoidance or oh crap button of the Gunbreaker. This will immediately lower the Gunbreaker's health to 1, but prevent any incoming damage to the Gunbreaker for a total of 8 seconds. It is on a respectable 360-second cooldown timer. In terms of Super Blide, I think that it's an ability that a lot of healers might not love. However, I think it's the second best tank cooldown for soaking or recovering from a bad situation. So I'm going to actually discuss other tanks just to kind of show why. Warrior and Dark Knight's abilities will let damage continue to rain down on them, potentially keeping their health at 1 HP, but by the time their equivalent abilities run out of duration, they might be still at 1 HP. However, Super Blide flat out denies any incoming damage effects meaning that sure, while your HP may be lowered to 1 upon use, and that can be very scary to healers who are unfamiliar with it, allows a healer to fill their health underneath the promise of no incoming damage. Also, if you're in a really bad situation where you think you might die, chances are your health is already really low and very close to 1, and so there's no real drawback in this instance of popping it. Fourthly, we have Aurora, and this is one of my favorite abilities in the game by far for tanks. This lets you apply 200 potency healing over time buff to your target of choice, including yourself. This will last 18 seconds and only has a short 60-second cooldown timer, meaning that you have roughly 1/3 uptime on this ability. Many people might wonder why I'm a fan of this, and so I'm going to take a little bit of time to explain. While it might not have the burst capacity that the Warrior's Equilibrium or Paladin's Clemency has that can instantly cap their health after eating a tank buster, or keep them alive long enough to recover some boss fights even after their healers died, this is a nice slow drawn out heal over time. I've talked in the past about the problem of Warrior's burst healing combining Thrill of Battle with Equilibrium for a massive chunk of health, and how this can very often lead to overhealing and massively lost value. Take the scenario where the tank gets hit by a tank buster in expert content or raids. This is something that the healers are going to be aware of from the cast bar from the enemy, and they will very often precast their biggest heals to pick you back up. Between two uncoordinated healers, this can be significant enough overheal, but when you add on top of that the warrior popping their burst heal, the overhealing potential goes extremely high, making these abilities essentially wasted and pointless. Paladin, on the other hand, does suffer that same problem, but it's even worse. Their Clemency ability, while extremely powerful and can save them from many situations where they have a dead healer, this requires a global cooldown and takes up significant chunks of MP, where MP is their managed resource for their part of their magical burst phase, meaning that each time they use their self-heal, they're losing significant chunks of their damage rotation. Now, while I digress and have talked about the warrior and paladin, it's necessary to have that background playing the other tanks to understand why I kind of fangirl over this ability. Aurora is off the global cooldown and costs no resources, and is essentially free to be used whenever you see fit as the Gunbreaker, as it is a slow trickle of health over time, and there's a far greater chance that over the 18 seconds duration of the ability, that you will actually reap some benefits from the heal and can minimize overhealing. Will it outright save you from a tank buster? No. It will not, but it will absolutely free up global cooldowns from your healers through the fight, and you will feel the impact of it overall. And it's free. There's literally no reason to not use it. Fifthly, we have the ability Heart of Stone, and this is the Gunbreaker's extremely short 25-second cooldown targeted buff that decreases the damage the target takes by 15% for 7 seconds. If an ally is targeted, they will gain the shield effective Brutal Shell. As a quick recap, Brutal Shell is the 150 potency shield you gain after using the second 1-2-3 rotation ability. With my current item level, it's a bit above 3k. Is the shield great? No. I really cannot tell you it's fantastic or game-changing, but you know what, it does add some sliver of value because you will usually cast this on the main tank before tank buster to get the most out of its 15% damage mitigation, and having a tiny shield I suppose is honestly better than not. It's not much, but better to have than not. Sixth and finally, we have Heart of Light, and this is an instant cast raid-wide magic damage reduction ability that reduces the damage dealt by magic abilities by 10% for all party members with the buff. However, this is also useful to cast on yourself if there is no need to use it for the raid-wide area of effect abilities, and can offer you some protection from tank busters. In terms of party utility, while we've already gone over the Gunbreaker abilities, I want to propose them again here to package them nicely under the scope of party utility. We however have yet to cover the next two abilities that are core to tank swapping mechanic, and so I want to cover those first. Provoke is an ability that will put you at the top of the enmity list of the mob, but will only give you +1 whatever the past highest enmity number was, meaning you'll want to quickly follow up with an ability like Lightning Shot. This is a mandatory ability from going from the off tank to the main tank position. Jerk is an ability that will pass 25% of your enmity to a team member. This ability is strongly suggested to be used when swapping from the main tank to the off tank position. In terms of party utility, the Gunbreaker is able to help offset the damage of raid-wide area of effect using their Heart of Light ability that gives allies a 15-second buff that reduces damage taken by 10%. Reprisal will lower the target's damage dealt by 10% for 5 seconds. Meaning both of these abilities can be used to reduce tank buster damage on one target as well. Combined together, these can reduce raid-wide damage by 20% or tank buster damage by 20%. For these two abilities, it is advised that you coordinate with your co-tank so that you can ensure one instance of Reprisal or Heart of Light or a different cooldown that's similar is up for each tank buster or raid-wide area of effect ability. As discussed before, Heart of Stone is on a very short cooldown and lets you give your tanky partner a decent chunk of mitigation. Finally, Aurora can be placed on your tanky partner to help relieve some pressure on the healers. One thing that I think is very critical to mention here about the utility that the Gunbreaker brings is that firstly, it's all free. There is no resource meter that is needed to be charged and consumed to use these abilities. All of these utility abilities can be used off the global cooldown, and all of them are instant with no special requirements to activate their effect. So compared to the other tanks, I'd say that the Gunbreaker's utility has an incredibly high quality of life and usability factor. In fact, for this high quality of life, this is why I actually gave the Gunbreaker a solid 4 out of 5 score on utility, despite not having a massive selection of utility to bring compared to the Paladin. In terms of macros for the Gunbreaker, I'd actually recommend 3 in particular. First off is a macro for Aurora that will let you focus on your current target during combat, and it will buff the target of the target. This is very handy in raiding situations when you're trying to focus on your own rotation, but still throw out your buffs onto either yourself or your co-tank. And then we're gonna also have a similar deal for the Heart of Stone macro. And then here during the tank swap phase, you just press the shirk button after your tanking partner uses provoke and therefore is the target of the raid boss, and this is going to give them the shirk effect. Oddly enough, this is actually something that should kind of help make sure that you wait for them to provoke the boss rather than pop shirk too early, because it's going to target the target of the target. Work smarter and not harder is all I can say is kind of like the core idea behind these 3 macros. Keep your focus on the boss and ensuring that your rotation and tank swaps go smoothly. In terms of macros to let your team know that you use provoke, shirk, or super belide, I personally don't consider these to add useful information or context to the group that they don't already know. Learning that you tank swapped and did your mechanic correctly isn't going to help the healers heal or the DPS deal more damage. Okay, and now onto the review section. Let's start off with the pros. The damage rotation is fairly engaging and has some solid intense periods that really keep you in your seat. The combo from Gnashing Fang to Savage Claw to Wicked Talon while weaving in Jugular Rip, Abdomen Tear, and Eye Gouge, all the while somehow stuffing in rough divide charges and Blasting Zone, is extremely intense and definitely rewarding, at least in my opinion, to use. And given how the Gunbreaker has a 60-second cycle, this means that every minute you'll have to conduct all of this at once. And so you generally have a very high, very intense, very cool and engaging rotation. Secondly, I'd say that their self-sustainability Aurora is free. It doesn't interfere with the rotation, and due to its healing over time effect has less chance to overheal when compared to other heals. Not to mention that the Gunbreaker's Brutal Shell adds 300 total mitigation potency, being split between health and shield. This means that the Gunbreaker still benefits even if their extremely attentive healer is spamming cure on them and keeping them at capped health. Likewise, that leads into the next point, that their utility is all free, and it is therefore super reliable. You don't need to worry about wasting mana or oath gauge or not having enough time to cast it in the first place. Fourthly, I'd say that the raw amount of mitigation cooldowns they have makes the Gunbreaker, in my experience, one of the most pleasurable tanks to do content with, because at any given moment you should be having some form of damage mitigation going. There's very little time that you're going to actually be exposed to the full brunt of an attack. Now for the cons. Compared to the other tanks, the Gunbreaker's ability to deal with heavy-hitting tank busters is pretty limited. Warriors can burst heal off the damage, which mind you does come with its own set of issues like overhealing that we talked about before. However, Dark Knight can shrug off tank busters absolutely laughing with its disgustingly gigantic shield. Gunbreaker's best attempt at handling a tank buster is by combining cooldowns such as Heart of Stone with Camouflage or Rampart, add up to a decent chunk of mitigation, and then use Aurora on themselves. Next off, I'd say Super Belide, reducing your health to 1 is jarring. Yes, you can plan to use this ability for specific mechanics like Titania's Fey Light, or during an oh crap moment when your health is also low to reduce how much health you lose. What's happened many times to me personally where my health goes low in a dungeon. I click the Super Belide button, but right immediately before I'm done clicking it, my white mage has used Benediction on me, which for the record will bring your health up to 100% no matter where you're at, and that's a very long cooldown for them. And I just lowered my HP from 100% to 1 HP and kind of made it pointless. Ouch. The third con is that if you don't have the rotation fully down, it is very easy to let your cooldown slide. What I mean is that if we have a tight 60-second recurring rotation, if we say miss hitting Gnashing Fang for 5 seconds, that is a 5-second delay that will continue through our circle, and ultimately that will make pairing it up with our next No Mercy cast a bit harder. And if this continues, then Gnashing Fang may come off cooldown and not line up at all with the 20-second No Mercy buff anymore. You might need to cast it for a reduced total potency. And so all of this being said, my final verdict on my time playing with the Gunbreaker is that if I honestly had to compare the Gunbreaker class to something, I'd say that it would be like driving a brand new Lamborghini. Everything feels smooth, responsive, fluid, and actions act exactly how you'd expect them to without swerving you off into left field or having buttons that seem broken or not taking an effect. Sure, you can drive its rotation poorly and see that your damage goes into the gutter, but regardless, it does overall what you expect it to. And so I'd say that while the Gunbreaker might not be the best main tank with respect to tank busters, because it doesn't have an absolutely gigantic spammable shield like the Dark Knights, it makes a very fantastic off tank with a really nice set of utility alongside its damage. But here I am downplaying how awesome it feels during a raid where the boss's normal attacks are actually hitting a decent amount of damage themselves, and on the Gunbreaker you overall get the most access to mitigation tools that can, over the course of a long duration of a fight, add up to a lot of total damage mitigated. In fact, when I'm doing Savage raiding with my group, I'm currently playing the Gunbreaker, and so that probably says a lot in and of itself. I've really fallen in love with this job and what it can bring to the table in terms of both its engaging damage rotation, its prolonged mitigation, and what it can do utility-wise. If I had to recommend a tank to someone just trying out tanking for the first time or who wanted to have the best possible experience, I'd easily recommend the Gunbreaker to anyone. Well, that's all for this video. Thanks for watching, and I hope that you enjoyed it, and if you'd like to help support me and my creation of this content, all that I ask is that you leave a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button. As I'm a newer YouTuber, every single like and subscribe truly honestly does go a very long way, and I'd super appreciate it. Let me know below, what are your thoughts on the Gunbreaker? Do you play it, or are you looking to start up? Maybe you think Gunblades are totally awesome. Let me know down below. And if you're interested in suggesting what class you'd like to see me cover next, please let me know. Thanks for watching and take care. Hope you have a fantastic day.